2018. I invite everybody to stand and sing along as our band under Ms. Carmen Zupfer will lead us in our national anthem.
I would like to welcome everyone here this morning to the Lakeview Public Schools and to our Veterans Day program. I am honored to be speaking to you today on such an important occasion. We gather here on Veterans Day to recognize and honor our service members for the sacrifices they have made to protect our great nation and the freedoms we have today. Veterans Day originated as Armistice Day on November 11, 1919. Which marked the one-year anniversary of the end of World War I. In 1926, the United States Congress passed a resolution for an annual observance, which became known as Veterans Day, November 11, 1938. Veterans Day pays tribute to all the veterans, those who are living and those who have gone before, who served the United States of America during war and peacetime. Over 16 million veterans served in at least one war, while another 5.2 million veterans have served in time of peace. Today we recognize over 21 million veterans in total for their service, sacrifice, and patriotism. I stand here today not only as a representative of the Lakeview School District, but as a grateful American citizen. You see, I never served in the military. I've never been to war. I've never left my children or family members for months or years at a time. Never shot at an enemy or witnessed the death of a friend in battle. I have been impacted by the service of my uncles and know the experiences in the military have been met with emotions and experiences that I as a citizen will never fully comprehend. I stand in front of you today in awe of what you have done for our country and consider each of you a hero. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a hero as a person admired for achievements, noble qualities, and showing great courage. This definition fits every veteran we honor today. Many of our veterans didn't ask to leave their families to fight in distant battles and wars. Many didn't even volunteer. The veterans we honor today were ordinary people like you and I who responded in extraordinary ways and in very dangerous times. They exhibited selflessness and were called to be part of something bigger than themselves. They are heroes because they possess courage, pride, determination, and dedication to the cause to protect this country and the freedoms we possess and often take for granted every day. They are heroes because they are humble about their service, achievements, and all they have done for this nation. We are a great nation and have a great way of life because of our veterans. President John F. Kennedy said, "As we express our gratitude, we must never forget that the highest appreciation is not just to utter words, but to live by them." President Kennedy was referring that our veterans deserve more than just the uttering of the words "thank you." They deserve us as citizens to express our thanks with love, with gratitude, and with humility. This is how they served us and this country. It is with a sincere heart that I extend each veteran today and every day. Thank you for your service and for all that you have done for our country. At this time, I'll call upon Mr. Palmer to reflect on his service. Thank you.
My name is Bill Palmer, but my students know me as Mr. Palmer. My dad was a veteran. He enlisted in the Navy in 1943 when he was 17 years old, about to graduate from high school in Fairfax, Minnesota, and the world was at war. He wanted to be a pilot. He graduated high school and reported to Corpus Christi Naval Air Station in Texas, where he spent months just cleaning out aircraft because he couldn't begin his flight training until he turned 18 in December. His flight and carrier qualification training took him through 5 different training sites before he received the gold wings of a Navy pilot 2 years later. He reported to his air wing aboard the aircraft carrier USS Tarawa, where she was anchored in Tokyo Bay after Japan's surrender ended World War II. He flew off the Tarawa for a year in the Western Pacific before returning to the States and leaving his active military service in 1947. Now, I know all this not because I grew up with the knowledge. My dad seldom talked about his Navy service when I was growing up. But I knew that he had served in the Navy in World War II. I knew that he had joined as a teenager and that he had flown off a carrier in the Pacific after the war ended. I admired him for that, although it was all pretty mysterious to me because he didn't talk about it. I knew what I knew from photos that I had seen and occasionally overhearing conversations that he had with sort of a Dutch uncle of ours who had been a Marine. I only learned the details of my dad's service much later. In fact, after I had completed my own military career. I began my military journey as a 17-year-old senior at Marshall High School when I accepted an Army ROTC scholarship. Dad's service probably helped me consider the military as a way of paying for college. You see, I wanted to go to college and study history. I know that's a real shocker to my students. But there was no money in my family for college, so the Army was my college ticket. I finished college and then law school before I began my service as an Army Judge Advocate Officer. That's a uniformed attorney. I thought I'd serve my 4-year obligation from that ROTC scholarship. Instead, I ended up serving 20 years, 7 months, and 21 days. My wife still asks me from time to time, whatever happened to our 4-year plan? Veterans Day today brings back memories of my dad. It also brings back memories of dozens of soldiers with whom I served and the many problems that we tackled as an Army team. Today brings back memories of cases and investigations I worked, places we lived, training deployments, temporary duty, and adventures I shared with my Army colleagues and with my family. I joined the Army as a way to pay to college. I made the Army a career because I enjoyed my colleagues, I enjoyed my work most of the time, and I enjoyed serving in a uniform that said U.S. Army and that it had our nation's flag right on the shoulder. I liked knowing that the work we were doing was important, that it was on behalf of all of you. I'll never forget that feeling. I'm very proud of my service. I still dream about the Army. It's a part of me. The Army is where I learned that I always needed to be a student. That's because I quickly realized when I put on the uniform, I had to rely on others to help me learn what I needed in order to succeed with my tasks and my missions. Sometimes my teachers were my superiors. Sometimes my teachers were my peers. And often my teachers were my military subordinates. I understood real fast that I needed to be open to learning from anyone who had the knowledge and skills who could help me become better, so that I, in turn, could be more useful to the people who were depending on me. That was just as true when I was a brand new lieutenant as when I was an experienced lieutenant colonel at the end of my career. The Army is also where I learned that I always needed to be a teacher, long before I was ever like a real teacher here. That's because soldiers wiser than I helped me realize I needed to be prepared to teach my military subordinates, my peers, and sometimes my military superiors about what I knew, so that they could be more useful to the people who were depending on them. This was true when I was a brand new lieutenant, and it became even more important as I gained experience as an experienced lieutenant colonel towards the end of my service. The Army is where I also learned I needed to accept responsibility for what I did and for what I failed to do. That's because soldiers more experienced than I helped me realize the tasks and missions that I had in front of me were things that others were depending on me to accomplish, so that they were able to do what they needed to do. If I did not know how to close out a task or needed help to do so, I learned to work with the team around me to figure out what we needed to do. I was never alone unless I failed to ask for help when I needed it. It was always about taking care of your responsibilities, but with a team to help whenever help was required. I was part of their team, they were part of my team. This was just as true when I was a brand new lieutenant as when I was an experienced lieutenant colonel at the end of my career. Finally, the Army is where I learned from the examples of others to leave my corner of the Army better for my having been there. It was always part of my job to help my team be a better team and to try and remove roadblocks to others' success. This was true when I was a brand new lieutenant and my corner of the Army was awfully small. And it was just as true when I was an experienced lieutenant colonel at the end of my career, and the corner of the Army I was able to influence was a lot larger. As a veteran, these are the attitudes and beliefs I brought with me when I returned to Marshall and ultimately joined the Lakeview team. I've always been really proud to be a part of this team that we all share, the Lakeview team. Our veterans in our communities are special people who understand what it means to serve others and with others as part of a team. They served on our behalf, often under difficult and sometimes dangerous circumstances. So today is a day to thank them for that service and to attend programs like this one to better understand what it means to be a veteran and what it means to be of service. They did something special. There are many ways to serve our country and to serve our communities, and I believe I can speak for all the veterans here today when I challenge each of you to look for ways in which you can be of service to others. That would be a great way to honor our veterans. I thank you for your attention, and I would direct your attention next to Ms. Carmen Zupfer and our band, and they're going to play another piece for us.
Good morning, everyone, and a special good morning to the community members and especially veterans who are sharing this time with us. The band will be playing a piece called Armed Forces on Parade by Andrew Bellent. This piece is a medley of service songs including Navy, Army, Marine, and Air Force.
Veterans, we would be honored if you would stand when your service song is played so you can be recognized for your service and time given to the United States military. These songs will go by quickly, and we will play them in this order: Navy, Army, Marine, Air Force. Audience, please hold your applause until the end of the piece so the veterans are able to hear their song, as each service song is not played in full, but rather a small portion is performed. Thank you.
Thank you, concert band. You guys always bring a lot of class to whatever you're performing for. I'm privileged now to introduce our guest speaker for the morning. Our Veterans Day speaker this year is Mr. John Thostison, who grew up in rural Hanley Falls and is a graduate from Granite Falls High School, so he's a kilowatt. He enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve a little later in life, becoming one of the oldest recruits in his boot camp platoon, and that has got to have been an interesting experience. He drilled and trained with the Marine Corps Reserve Unit headquartered in Minneapolis. The Marine Corps trained Mr. Thostison as a military policeman and assigned him to a military police company at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, near the Minneapolis airport. Mr. Thostison served overseas in a training assignment in South Korea in late 1990, and he deployed to Saudi Arabia, where he participated in the Gulf War of 1991 as part of an international coalition of forces fighting to remove the invading Iraqi army from the small country of Kuwait that they had invaded. Today, John farms just southeast of Hanley Falls and serves on the board of directors of the Farmers Cooperative Elevator. He is married to his wife, Terry. They have one adult son together, Joseph, and two stepsons, Eric and Pat. Let's give a warm Lakeview welcome to our Veteran of the Day, Mr. John Thostison.
It's a hard act to follow. Thank you very much. Good morning, Lakeview students, faculty, fellow veterans, and members of this community. Mr. Palmer called me a month or so ago and asked if I would be willing to speak here today, and I consider it a privilege to do so. I was born in Clarkfield, Minnesota, when it still had a hospital, and grew up on our farm near Hanley Falls, Minnesota. I attended grade school at the old Hanley Falls Public School and high school in Granite Falls, where we too had Veterans Day programs. Unfortunately, Veterans Day to me at that time meant going to the auditorium and treating it as goof-off time instead of listening to some old guy speak. But I must have listened, because I remember one year that old guy was a Korean War veteran. I remember he talked about the honor of serving one's country. I remember even more clearly that he also talked of the frigid cold in Korea, the bitter fighting, and of old friends long gone. He said it was an honor to serve. I come from a military family. My dad served in the Navy during World War II. His two brothers served in the Marine Corps and Army. My mom's brother also served in the Navy. My two sisters served in the Navy during peacetime, where they met their husbands, who were also serving in the Navy. I felt I had to join the military to continue the tradition, but I didn't at first. Life threw me some curveballs, as it usually does sometimes with everyone, and I went through some difficult years. I didn't know what I was going to do, but it still seemed to me that the military was calling. I eventually signed up for the Marine Reserve's Military Police Company in Fort Snelling, Minneapolis. So on a mild February day in 1987, I took the bus to the military entrance station in Minneapolis. After a couple days of tests, we Marine recruits reported to B-100. The basement level, after walking down a long dark hallway into a small room where we were sworn in as Marine recruits. Later that day, I was in the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, California, and it was a long day. Before we got off the bus, the Marine drill instructor walked on and told us, from now on, the first and the last words out of your mouth is, "Sir, do you understand?" We answered, "Yes, sir." Whoops. Get off my bus right now. Welcome to boot camp. If you ever enlist in the military, you'll never forget your drill instructors. I'll never forget one of mine. He was a man of about my height and thin. Every recruit had to climb a certain hill in field training. The hill has a name I cannot repeat here, but it is a 45-degree angle climb for 300 yards. When this drill instructor reached the top of the hill, just for the sake of showing off, he took off his pack and emptied it in front of us. Out came 3 50-pound weights. After boot camp, I trained for 2 months at Military Police School in San Antonio, Texas, and began my reserve training. We trained 1 week in a month and 2 weeks a year for annual training duty, otherwise known as ATD. We spent our ATD at places like 29 Palms, California for desert training, Quantico, Virginia for MP garrison duty, and Thunder Bay, Ontario for cold weather training, where we snowshoed in the woods on a full moon night in 20 below zero temperatures. In the spring of 1990, I signed up for an ATD to South Korea, scheduled for the first 3 weeks in November. In early August of that year, the Mideast nation of Iraq invaded its much smaller neighboring country of Kuwait. This was big news at the time. Iraq was led at the time by a ruthless dictator named Saddam Hussein. The U.S. had once supported him during the years-long war between Iraq and Iran, but the U.S. and the United Nations condemned his invasion of Kuwait. Our president, George H.W. Bush, immediately started deploying troops to the neighboring Saudi Arabia to discourage Saddam Hussein from turning his sights on yet another country. The troop buildup continued for the rest of that year. While this deployment was underway, I and 12 other Marines from our unit went to South Korea in November for our ATD. On the plane ride home, we all thought that it wasn't a question of if, but when our unit would be called up for deployment. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Al Gray, said at that time, there are two kinds of Marines, those that are in Saudi Arabia and those that are going to Saudi Arabia. Sure enough, we were called up to be deployed and things moved fast. By December 2nd, our MP company was at the Minneapolis airport ready to fly to Marine Corps Camp Lejeune, South Carolina. Both our U.S. Senators, David Durenberger and Paul Wellstone, spoke to us before we left, as did Minnesota's future governor, Jesse Ventura. Of those three men, it was Jesse Ventura who made the effort to talk to each of us. As a result of that, we respected him in a special way. We spent nearly a month at Camp Lejeune. We did a lot of what we call NBC training. NBC means nuclear, chemical, and biological. Since Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons in his war against Iran, we took this training very seriously. We received MOP gear. MOP is simply a military acronym which stands for Mission-Oriented Protective Posture. The gear consists of a chemical-resistant suit, boots, gloves, and a gas mask. There are 4 MOP levels. Each level determines how much of the gear we are required to wear at a certain time. Training and working in MOP gear was hot and uncomfortable, but we knew we needed to get used to it in case we encountered chemical weapons. After completing our training at Camp Lejeune, we left on a U.S. 747 aircraft with other Marine units for the port city in Saudi Arabia. I remember getting off the plane and being bused to a place simply called Camp 15. While on that bus, we passed what seemed like tens of thousands of military vehicles, Humvees, trucks, and the like, parked near this huge port. It was America at its mightiest, as far as I was concerned. Once we arrived at Camp 15, we really didn't do anything for 2 or 3 weeks. It seems like that's just the way things work in an operational deployment like that. They are in a hurry to get you, but once they get you there, they have to figure out what they're going to do with you. By late January, though, we became part of a newly formed MP company and we were off to the desert. We traveled around a lot, never staying in the same spot for more than 2 nights, which was a good thing. The scorpions and snakes were attracted to our body heat and would crawl into our fighting holes to snuggle up with us. One night, a cobra found a nice comfy spot in my fighting hole under another Marine's neck. During the day in January and February, the daytime temps would reach a high of maybe 90 degrees. It's a dry heat, but it will cool off fast once the sun got close to the horizon. Nighttime temperatures would usually drop into the high 30s. We simply learned to stay warm at night. A coalition force, including over 38 nations, led by the United States, struck back at Saddam Hussein's invasion army in mid-January of 1991 with massive airstrikes. But the reality of war hit us in a more immediate way when we crossed the minefield on the Saudi-Kuwait border. Shortly after we entered occupied Kuwait, we received an alert over the radio net of a unit involving chemical weapons. Our commander ordered us to MOP Level 3, which meant wearing all of our gear except for the gloves. It was difficult to do any kind of activity when wearing this gear, and we were pretty anxious and uncomfortable for the duration of this alert. We had the masks on for approximately 1 or 2 hours before we could take them off. It turned out to be a false alarm. Iraqi prisoners were out surrendering to us by the thousands. They all seemed to be carrying these leaflets in Arabic, which our Air Force had dropped, and I happen to have one right here, if anyone would like to see one later on. Here it is. They were all different versions of these, but they basically said the same thing: surrender to us. If you don't, you will lose your life. Having 15 to 20 Iraqis surrender to 2 U.S. Marines was a common occurrence. The average Iraqi soldier had no desire to fight this war. Behind the concertina wire fence barrier, which we had set up to contain them, you could see it in their eyes. Most were on the brink of severe malnutrition. Handing out MREs, that's our field rations, called meals ready to eat, to the prisoners caused a food riot. These Iraqi soldiers hadn't been taking care of their weapons, so when we confiscated them as they surrendered to us, most weapons were unclean and even rusted. Their uniforms were not much more than rags. They all wanted the basic necessities of life. Of course, there were exceptions to the sad conditions of many Iraqi soldiers. Some units were loyal to Saddam Hussein and were willing to fight for him, but they were unable to effectively defend themselves and were overrun by coalition forces. The ground war ended after 100 hours of combat. Then the sky turned strangely dark. Saddam had ordered his retreating troops to set fire to over 700 oil wells in the region. We soon found that when an oil well burns, not all of the oil burns. We noticed little black specks on our camouflage uniforms. It was unburned oil. It was falling from the sky, and it was worse the closer you got to a burning well. I saw camels coated in it, and it wasn't a pretty sight. The fires hastened our departure. Our military leadership didn't want us near them, so we were able to go home early. We were welcomed home to cheering and jubilation. It was wonderful, but I couldn't help but think of our Vietnam War veterans and the way they were treated. Nearly the opposite of what we experienced, I'm sad to say. I look back at the time that I spent in the desert, and I think of the images of the Iraqis and the smells of the desert. What does my service mean to me? I think about my time in the service nearly every day. In that respect, it's still a part of my life. I know that it made me a more knowledgeable person on many issues, and it made me appreciate the sacrifices of all the men and women who didn't come home from a distant land, and also the ones who did come home who carry the physical and emotional scars with them. The price of freedom comes in a high cost. How high? Over 240 years ago, a small guerrilla army struggled, learned, and eventually prevailed over a much larger and better equipped army of the strongest nation in the world. That was our Revolutionary War, and it created our nation. It came at a high cost, but thousands of veterans came home from that war. Veterans came home from the Civil War battlefields of Gettysburg, Antietam, and Bull Run. They came home from the World War I battlefields of the Argonne Forest, Belleau Wood, and Chateau Thierry. They came home from the World War II battles of Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, Normandy, and Iwo Jima. Imagine this. From this point in Cottonwood, go 2 miles north, go 4 miles west, 2 miles south, and 4 miles back to this point. That's 8 square miles. Not a big area, is it? You could probably walk that in a couple hours. Imagine it's an island out in the Western Pacific in World War II. Next, imagine 20,000 Marines, Army, and Navy personnel are landing on the beaches of that island and are fighting soldiers of Imperial Japan entrenched on that island. In a little over a month's time, 7,000 Americans were killed on that one battle. Talk about a high price. The island is called Iwo Jima, where uncommon valor was a common virtue. The battle was in the last months of World War II in 1945. Millions of veterans came home from that battle and hundreds of others across the Pacific, the North Atlantic, North Africa, and Europe. Veterans came home from the Korean War battles at Incheon and the Chosin Reservoir, and from the Vietnam battles at Khe Sanh in the 1968 Tet Offensive. They came home from combat in Beirut, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They came home to start families, to start careers, to be members of your community. If fate had took a more tragic turn, they came home in flag-draped coffins, like Corporal Stephen Benslin and First Lieutenant Jason Timmerman, residents of our region who grew up among us, volunteered to serve our nation, and were killed in combat. I like to keep up on the issues that face veterans in today's America, issues like physical disabilities, mental health challenges such as suicide and economic hardship. So what's your best way to thank a veteran? Make something of your life. Be a good citizen. Exercise your hard-fought-for freedoms and vote. Be your best here in school and beyond, and you are our nation's future. It was an honor to serve you. Thank you.
Thank you for your service, Mr. Thorstensen, and thank you for being willing to share your experiences with us. And now, Team Lakeview, I'd like to welcome to the performance venue to my right here, Ms. Krishana Dempsey and the Lakeview Concert Choir, who will share some of their music with us.
Marching on.
As we conclude here today, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. Thank you, students, for being respectful listeners. Thank you, Mr. Palmer, for organizing this event. Thank you, Mr. Tostenson, for your words today. It was great to hear of your experience and your service. And just thank you to all veterans that were able to join us today for your service. Could we have our veterans stand that are in attendance today? We'd like to send you out with a round of applause from our students. So if we could have our veterans stand. Thank you for your service. Thank you. Students, we will dismiss back to the last part of third hour. We'll ask junior high, 7th and 8th grade, you guys can go ahead and go now. We'll go out the west